fun Western New York history is it's history that is often left out of the textbooks that you have in school. Not your kind of standard fare you'd see in the history books, but it's a lot of fun, and you kind of wonder why people don't really include this in our schoolwork. So for our first story, in our first history lesson, we're going to go down the expressway there, across 490, and then down to the Ithaca area. And once we get down to Ithaca, we're going to look for the Cornell campus over there in the corner of the city and go up there on the hill to the Cornell campus. And we're going to look for a particular hall on Cornell campus. It's called Uris Hall. It's got this funny looking statue out in front, easy to spot. We'll get into the hall and we'll take the stairways up to the second floor of this hall. And down at the end of the hall is this doorway. And we're going to go in, and it's going to be a very darkly, dimly lit room. But once our eyes get adjusted to the light, what we're going to see against one wall is this big line of brains in glass jars. It's called the Wilder Brain Collection. And there'll be a whole series of brains there with some descriptions. And this is a brain collection that was gathered up by a Civil War surgeon by the name of Dr. Wilder. And he originally had over 100 brains in this collection. And now there's only about a dozen or so surviving brains that we have. But when you look over the brains, one of these brains is going to catch your eye. And it's going to stand out from the other brains because it's so large. As a matter of fact, it's the second largest brain on record that's ever been preserved. And as you would expect from somebody that had such a large brain, he was able to accomplish quite a few things. The person that had this brain was a teacher, as well as studied law, studied medicine, was an investor, mastered 7 languages, and authored an innovative linguistic textbook that proposed a new method in the formation of languages. And in addition to those accomplishments, he had one other notable thing in his past. He was a famous serial killer. His name was Edward Ruloff. And he murdered 7 people. 3 men, 2 women, and 2 infants. He didn't get away with his crimes. He was sentenced to hang. And as they placed the rope around his neck, he said, "Hurry it up. I want to be in hell in time for dinner." Charming fellow, huh? Well, let's take a look at Edward Ruloff's story here. He was originally born up in Canada, over in St. John's, New Brunswick here, in 1820. His parents were German immigrants, the family name was actually Ruloff's son. And he was the third in line of these 3 sons. His older brother, Albert, was a very successful lumber merchant. His brother, William, was president of the National Photographic Association and a very famous photographer. And being third in line here with these 2 accomplished brothers, there was a lot of pressure on him to achieve as well. He had very little formal education, but Edward Ruloff was very intelligent and very interested in learning, very interested in books. He was socially very charming. Everybody that met him said he was very engaged. It was very easy for him to kind of win people over. He was very ambitious. He wanted to achieve and get things like his brothers did, but wasn't really a hard worker like his other brothers were. So the parents got him a job early on as a store clerk. And as he was working as a clerk in the store had a series of fires, arsons. And then they found out following these arsons, there were actual burglaries, that someone was setting these fires to cover up the theft of items. And also this got associated after each of these events that Ruloff would have some type of new possession. He'd show up at the store within a very expensive brand new suit of clothes, which would be difficult to afford on his clerk's salary. So they were able to link these arsons and these burglaries back to Ruloff, that he was stealing from his own store as a clerk, and he was sentenced to 2 years in jail for these burglaries. Well, he was released from jail in 1842, and he changed his name to Ruloff, one of a whole series of aliases he wound up taking on in his life. And he decided to migrate over to the United States from Canada. And he found his way down to Ithaca, actually just outside of Ithaca, the adjoining town, Dryden, New York. And since he was so well read, he got a job as a school teacher, even though he didn't have a lot of formal schooling, but he was extremely well read. And he wanted to be something more than a school teacher, so he started studying simultaneously both medicine and law. Now, back in those days in New York State in the mid-1800s, you didn't necessarily have to graduate from a law school or a medical school. You just had to basically pass some exams. And many people, they would self-study, like, for example, Lincoln, of course, self-studied law. Or for medicine, you would study under a tutor. You would study under a physician. And he was studying under a particular physician by the name of Dr. Bull. Now, the physician he was studying under, Dr. Bull, had a niece. Her name was Harriet Schutt, and she was only 17 years old, and Edward took a liking to her and started to court her. But it was much to the chagrin of the Schutt family. The Schutt family did not like Edward Ruloff, did not trust him, did not want him to court the daughter. But in spite of the Schutt family's misgivings, Edward Ruloff married Harriet Schutt, and he was 25 and she was 17. And shortly after, they had a young daughter by the name of Priscilla. Now, Edward's new wife, Harriet, had a brother by the name of Will, and he was married, had his wife Amelia and a small infant. And the whole family became very ill at some point. It's some type of disease that the doctors, local doctors, really couldn't discern exactly what it was. And Will Schutt started to recover, but his wife and infant were still extremely ill. So Edward Ruloff volunteered to help. I mean, he was studying medicine, and even though the Schutt family had these misgivings about Edward, Will was kind of desperate because his infant and the wife were quite ill. And he thought, well, what's the harm in getting Edward Ruloff to look at them? So Edward Ruloff examined them and kind of did some treatments, but the wife and daughter kept weakening and weakening, and eventually they passed on. Now, what we found out later, they didn't know at this point, but later in the story we'll find out that actually Edward Ruloff was not volunteering to help the family, but more seeking revenge against the family because of their disapproval. And what he actually did was poisoned the wife and the small infant with a copper compound. And he knew from his medical studies and knowledge that that would produce severe anemia in somebody and severely weaken them. And in their weakened state from the illness plus this, they passed away from this poisoning. Well, the Schutt family became suspicious of Edward Ruloff, and he was treating Harriet Schutt very poorly, both Harriet and the infant, very abusive towards his wife. So after the Bill Schutt's wife and infant died, and the family started getting suspicious, he suddenly proposed that they pack up and move to Ohio because that's where he wanted to practice law. But the wife objected. She was getting more suspicious of her husband, and she wanted to stay closer to the rest of her family. And when she refused to move, a violent argument broke out. And Edward Ruloff was working with a mortar and pestle, practicing some of his medicinal things with the compound, and he wound up picking up the pistol and bludgeoning his wife and infant daughter to death. Well, the next day, he showed up, Edward Ruloff showed up at his neighbor's house. And he said, you know, I have this truck that my one relative loaned me. He lives down by the Pennsylvania border, and I need to get it back to him. Can I borrow your hitching wagon to take it over there? And the neighbor agreed to do that. But he noticed that when Edward Ruloff rode off, he didn't ride south towards Pennsylvania. He actually rode up north. And people spotted him with this wagon and this trunk up by Cayuga Lake. And they saw him unloading some heavy stacks from this around Cayuga Lake. Well, he returned, and the wagon to the neighbor, but the trunk was still there. And the neighbor said, well, you know, why didn't you return the trunk? He says, well, you know something, we made a sudden decision that we're going to move to Ohio, myself, my wife, and my daughter, and we decided, my relative let me keep the trunk so I can go to Ohio. So, you know, we're going to be leaving this afternoon. Could you please look after the house for us? We'll be back at some time for some of our other types of things. And he takes off and he flees to Ohio. Well, the Schutt family was very suspicious. They were very suspicious about the death of Will Schutt's wife and daughter, and now they're not hearing anything from Harriet. So there was no word from Harriet, so they go to the house and they find it all in disarray, as though some type of struggle happened there. And so they talk to the neighbor, and the neighbor talks about him, you know, this wagon and borrowing it, and you know, the next day he thought he was going to Pennsylvania, but he went up north someplace with the thing, and he told them suddenly that he was going to Ohio. But they went and looked at the house, and all of Harriet's clothes and possessions were still there. So how could she be moving to Ohio with her husband if she's not going to take anything with her? Matter of fact, the one skirt that she was wearing, you know, the day before, you know, was laying there across the one chair. Like all of her clothes are just about accounted for. So the family did an all-out search for Harriet and her husband. And in the meantime, they contacted the sheriff and they asked him to exhume Will Schutt's wife and child. This was the couple that the wife and child that he poisoned. Well, Edward Ruloff saw all this activity going on, and all of a sudden, he made an appearance. Okay? He couldn't find him, but all of a sudden he made an appearance. And he said, oh, I did go to Ohio with my wife and child, and she wound up abandoning me. You know, we had an argument and she wound up abandoning me. And so I came back here thinking she kind of went back home. So I was going to come back and apologize and make up to her so we can go back to Ohio. And of course, family was not buying all of this. So they got a further order from the sheriff, and they had found out about this report of that he was seen up by Cayuga Lake unloading these sacks. So they got an order from the sheriff to dredge Cayuga Lake to search for these sacks in the area that he was seen. So Edward Ruloff sees all of this going on, and he flees back to Ohio. While he was in Ohio, they tried to extradite him, but Ruloff was quite charming and quite convincing and quite articulate. And he was able to convince the local authorities there of his complete innocence. And the whole thing was a misunderstanding, and he's going to go back himself in a little while and straighten it out, and there's no need to extradite him back. So they don't extradite him. Well, the family decides that they need to take matters into their own hands, and the Schutt family hired a bounty hunter who went down there, and he tracked down Ruloff. And as charming as Ruloff was, the bounty hunter didn't care. He wanted his fee and took him back for prosecution. So they went to prosecute Ruloff for the potential murder of his wife and also the potential poisoning of the infant daughter and wife of Will Schutt. But the dredging of Cayuga Lake was unsuccessful. So without the bodies, they were not able to get any type of murder conviction for him for murdering his wife. Furthermore, there wasn't enough evidence in the Schutt family poisonings. I mean, forensic medicine wasn't what it is today. And it was very difficult for them to try to prove that these daughter and wife were, infant and wife were poisoned, especially so long after they were buried. But they did charge Schutt, as well as those murders, with kidnapping of the wife. And they did have good evidence for that because the house was in disarray, her clothes were still there, and she was missing. So the jury was able, with that evidence, to find him guilty of kidnapping, and the judge gave him the maximum sentence of 10 years. They sent him to Auburn prison. And while there, he spent his prison term studying languages and linguistics. And it was here that he wrote this book proposing a new theory on how languages were formed, the method and formation of languages. And he was just as articulate and just as charming in jail. And he was able to convince the head jailer of his complete innocence. And the head jailer was convinced that he was a wrongly convicted man, that had an injustice done to him. So much so that the jailer had his son, Edward Jarvis, tutored by Ruloff, had him tutor him in various languages, tutor him in Latin and Greek so he could do better in his schoolwork. Well, when the jail term was pending completion, the Schutt family tried to have him arrested for the murder of his wife. They couldn't stand to see him get out of jail and get away with this murder. But from Ruloff studying law, and he knew his law, he immediately claimed double jeopardy. He said, "You already tried me for this. I was found not guilty because you couldn't have a body. I cannot be tried again for that crime." But the family had another ace up their hole. They said, "We're going to charge you with the murder of the infant daughter." Because at the original trial, they charged him with the murder of the wife, but not with the infant daughter. So this time they charged him for the infant daughter. So they keep him in jail pending the trial, but Ruloff escapes. And he escapes with the help of none other but the head jailer's wife and son, Jarvis. This was the fellow that he was tutoring. The wife and son were so convinced that he was a wrongly convicted person and persecuted because he was so intelligent, he was so charming, and he was so articulate. There's no way he was like these other criminals in jail. So they helped him escape. But Ruloff escapes and he has to live out into the woods. And he winds up eating wild nuts and food stolen from farms. And this was kind of in the wintertime. He wound up losing 2 toes from frostbite. He starts making these petty thefts to support himself, and he gets caught trying to burglarize a jewelry store. And when he gets caught, he goes before the judge and saying, "Well, the money wasn't for me. The money was really for this Jarvis family, that I heard the head jailer lost his job because I escaped and they needed money, and I was actually trying to raise money for them." Well, Jarvis doesn't get prosecuted at this point for the murder of the infant. Instead, he gets sent to jail for this burglary of the jewelry store. And he gets sent up to Sing Sing prison for a couple of years. And while he was there, he met a fellow prisoner, and upon his release, he formed a burglary ring with a fellow prisoner he met by the name of William Dexter, plus the jailer's son, Edward Jarvis, joined him in this burglary ring now. And they commit a series of these petty burglaries and crimes. Sometimes they got caught in jail for just a small amount of time. But Ruloff finally plans a very large heist. He says we need to do a major kind of burglary here. So he plans a burglary of a store that's over in Binghamton, New York. And among other things, this store stocks a lot of rare silks, which Ruloff knows he could fence for a large amount of money. So this is kind of a big deal to do this burglary. So he plans it out. So the store actually had two clerks that lived upstairs and slept up there because the owner knew he had very valuable merchandise and he wanted somebody in the store at all times. But Ruloff, through his knowledge of medicine, came up with a plan to burn some chloroform and up in the upstairs hallway, and the fumes would go and knock out the two clerks, Frederick Merrick and Gilbert Burroughs, and then they could do the burglary and get away with it. So he sets off the chloroform, it goes upstairs, but Jarvis trips over something and makes a lot of noise. And they weren't quite out from the chloroform, and Merrick, this particular clerk, winds up waking up. So Merrick wakes up and he kept a pistol by his bedside for just such emergencies. And he decided to take the pistol and walk down and see if anything was happening down there. And sure enough, he winds up confronting the burglars. So he fires the pistol, but it misfires, and there's a major struggle that goes on. And he winds up struggling with Jarvis. And as he's struggling with Jarvis, Ruloff comes up behind the clerk, Merrick, and shoots him dead. Well, by this time, the other clerk had awoken, sees this kind of commotion, they flee, and they summon the authorities, and there's a big manhunt on for these three men that tried this burglary and murdered the store clerk, Merrick. And in the description for them, they're searching for three men, one with an unusually large head. And that, of course, was Ruloff with his large brain. He had a very large skull. So somebody spotted Ruloff up along these railroad tracks, and they went after him, and he wound up going into a farmer's field, and he hid in the farmer's outhouse. And that's where they arrested him. The other two men they found drowned in a river in a very peculiar kind of circumstances. And on the river's edge where they were drowned, they found a pair of boots. And the boots did not belong to either of these men. As a matter of fact, both men were found wearing their shoes when they were drowned, which was kind of quite odd. But they did have Ruloff, and then the trial began. Now, Ruloff was quite well known at this point when this hit the papers, because there was these suspicions of these prior murders, and there was these jail escapes. And it was a huge amount of people wanted to attend the trial. They could not attend it in the normal courtroom. Instead, they held it in a special hall that held 1,000 people. But they had over 2,000 people crammed into this hall to watch this trial. And all of the major newspapers covered this, actually up and down the East Coast. The Philadelphia papers, the New York City papers, the Boston papers, they all had reporters at this big trial. It was literally the trial of the century in the 1800s. And the prosecution starts laying out their case against Ruloff, the genius murderer. And they said, well, we found a little newspaper article, and it was torn at the scene of the burglary, at the scene of this store where Merrick was shot. And they went back to the rooming house where Ruloff was staying, and they found the matching piece of the newspaper article. So there was evidence there that he was there at that crime scene. Plus, they talked to the landlady there. And the landlady says, yeah, I saw Ruloff there with Jarvis and Dexler, and they were always getting together and meeting them. So they knew they were all together as this kind of burglary. Plus, those shoes came on to play. The drowning of those two men seemed very peculiar to the authorities. They knew those two men could not swim a lick. Yet, if you look at the place where they crossed the river, I mean, there was one area where it was very deep, but the rest of the river was very shallow, that you could just easily walk across the river. And they were wearing their shoes. So it seems odd, why would they cross the river in that one little spot where it's incredibly deep, wearing their shoes? And they identified the shoes on the bank as being Ruloff's, because I mentioned when he escaped from jail and it was out in the winter that he lost 2 toes. They knew from looking at the one shoe, it belonged to somebody that was missing 2 toes on the one foot. So what they feel happened, and what Ruloff later wound up admitting, is that he felt that he could blame, if he was caught, the murder of the store clerk on either Jarvis or Drexler. And they couldn't talk if they were dead. So he convinced them to cross this river. He knew the river well because he used to cross it in a wagon a lot of times. He knew where it was shallow and where it was deep. And he purposely led the men through the little channel of the river where it's extremely deep so they could drown. And then he swam back. But on top of that, the other store clerk, Gilbert Burroughs, did wake up in the commotion and was able to come down and see and identify Ruloff and saw him shooting Merrick and said he could identify all of this stuff. So it looks like they have Ruloff dead to rights. But with all of this evidence, many people were convinced Ruloff was still innocent. And you say to yourself, why could there possibly be so much controversy about his guilt? Well, Ruloff's defense largely, the public and press didn't know what to make of Ruloff. Ruloff's defense was largely, how could such a well-spoken genius like me, who's so accomplished that I know law and I know medicine, I know linguistics, I published this novel book, on the formation of languages, I'm so well-spoken. Have you ever seen any kind of common criminal who was so accomplished? Do you know anybody who's this accomplished that commits this type of low-life type crimes? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. And a lot of people in the public and press bought this argument because they said, well, that's right, that doesn't make sense. We've never seen this before. Even a young journalist that worked for the New York Telegraph by the name of Mark Twain wrote an editorial during the trial. And he proposed, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, of providing a substitute to be hanged in Ruloff's place after the example of Cindy Carton, who took the place of Charles Darnay in Dickens' Tale of Two Cities, saying that, well, there's so much controversy, maybe somebody should be hung in his place. Of course, he said this somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but privately, Twain said he did have his doubts on whether Ruloff was guilty or not. Well, the reason Ruloff was able to fool so many people was, today we're familiar with this idea of someone being a psychopath. And psychopathy isn't really a definition or word that's used in psychiatry. The term for that would be an antisocial personality disorder, especially one extremely manifested in perverted, criminal, or amoral behavior. And those people can be very superficially charming. Psychopaths tend to make a good first impression on others and often strike observers as remarkably normal. And we're familiar with these terms, and we're familiar with other famous people in history that have been identified as psychopaths. But this condition was not really fully diagnosed and defined until 50, 60 years later into the 20th century. So it was kind of unknown at this time. So they weren't used to any of this kind of phenomena like Ruloff. But despite all of this, the judge and jury were not fooled, and he was declared guilty of the murder of Merrick and sentenced to hang. And while he was awaiting hanging, he gave many interviews in the jail, bragging of his accomplishments. And during those interviews, he did confess on how he did perform his crimes. And that's how we know he used the copper compounds and did the other murders of Jarvis and the other people. Now, even after his death, and then of course he had the famous saying, they put the noose around his neck. Though some people say the actual last thing he said was the platform is kind of unsteady. He was tipping on it a little bit. They made a death mask of Edward Ruloff because he was so famous. This is his death mask. Over 6,000 people came to view Ruloff's corpse. And actually 90% of them were from out of town. You can see how many people came from all over the East to this trial for this big sensational thing that was happening. Ruloff donated his head before he was hung to Dr. Wilder because he heard about the brain collection and he thought his brain would be worthwhile keeping. But it was not well known. And after Ruloff was hung, a bunch of medical students actually tried to dig up his grave to get at his head and get at his brain to study. And they were surprised to see when they opened his coffin that it was headless because he already donated the brain to Dr. Wilder. Well, was Ruloff a real genius or just a clever con man? I mean, modern linguists have taken a look at the book he wrote and they said really it isn't all that impressive or all that great a theory that he came up with. But you can travel down to Cornell and go into that darkened room up on the second floor of Yours Hall and see Ruloff's brain there among the others in the Wilder brain collection. And the other kind of notable thing there over in Cornell having to do with Ruloff is there's a place called College Town's Best Restaurant and Bar. And they named this place Ruloff's after the famous serial killer that existed there over 150 years ago. Well, let's go to another story in Western New York history. Something a little more fun than a serial killer. Most people are familiar with Japanese rickshaw. Rickshaw is kind of a funny word. Actually, rickshaw is kind of a little bit of a cutting short of the full name. The full Japanese name for rickshaw is jin rickshaw. And it's called that way because the word jin means human, and riki means powered, and shaw is a vehicle. So jin rickshaw means a human-powered vehicle. And this quintessential Japanese vehicle was actually invented in Western New York, believe it or not. In particular, it was invented over in northern Steuben County in the town of Wayne. And it was invented by this fellow, Jonathan Goebel. He was born in the town of Wayne in 1827, and he had a very hot temper that wound up landing him in Auburn prison for 2 years. And he tried to reform in his prison sentence, and he learned how to repair shoes. And besides learning how to repair shoes, he got religion. And he decided his life's goal now was to be a missionary. But he couldn't find a financial sponsor to become a missionary. To become a missionary and send someone abroad, it takes money. You need passage, you need funds to be set up in that area, you need Bibles and all kinds of other materials to hand out. And with his past as a convict, nobody really kind of trusted him to give him this kind of money and send him off. They were afraid he was going to steal it. So he came up with another plan, and that was to get international experience by joining the Navy. So he joined the US Navy as a Marine. And one of his early assignments as a Marine was a very famous one, where he accompanied Commodore Perry when he sailed into Tokyo Bay in Japan in 1853 and quote unquote opened up Japan to the Western world and to trade. Now, while Jonathan Goebel was on this mission, he befriended a fellow Marine who was from his area, Frank Pole of Pulteney, New York. Pulteney, New York. Now it's known as Pulteneyville. He also befriended Santaro. Japan's Sam Patch was his nickname. Now, it wasn't the same Sam Patch that jumped over the falls here in Rochester. It was a different Sam Patch. And what this was about was that before Perry sailed for Japan, over in the China Sea, an American vessel came upon a Japanese junk that was floundering. And they rescued all the sailors from the junk, and they brought them back to San Francisco. And the idea was when Perry goes to Japan, he was either going to use these sailors as kind of barter to get in or as a token of goodwill. And it turned out kind of at the last second, Perry decided he wanted to do a show of force. So the only kind of person from this rescue junk that he brought with them was Santaro. as a translator because he spoke English quite well. He learned English quite well. Well, Goebel got an idea, and he decided to bring Santero back to Western New York with him to teach him Japanese and learn the culture. And then he was going to return to Japan with Santero as this first Baptist missionary there, which he did, and actually became quite successful in Japan as a missionary. He had quite a line of accomplishments. He translated and published the Gospel of Matthew, the first Christian scripture ever printed in Japan. Preached to all levels of Japanese society, very high levels, the samurai, the merchants, but as well as the low levels, the outcast and the blind. He was very active as an interpreter, translator, writer, lecturer, merchant, builder. He was kind of a jack of all trades. And he rubbed elbows with a lot of the elite in Japan. Prime ministers, leading jamos, the founder of the Mitsubishi financial empire, and other notable people. So he traveled quite a bit among Japan, but he had some issues because his wife became quite ill and became an invalid. And it was very difficult for his wife to move around. They tried using a litter, hand-carried litter, but actually that's a fairly bumpy ride when people are kind of jostling you around in one of these litters. So Jonathan was reading one of his wife's magazines. And one of them was a very famous Godley's Ladies book, which was like the Ladies' Home Journal of its day. And he saw some advertisements there for a baby carriage. And you think, I need something like a baby carriage, but for an adult. And then he was thinking about harness racing sulkies. And then he had this concept that he sketched out of this kind of a rickshaw. And he remembered his fellow Marine, Frank Pillay. Now, Pillay had to leave the Marines. He wound up damaging his hearing with these cannon blasts during some exercises. So he set himself up in a wagon shop, and Jonathan sends him these sketches and asks him if he could build something like this for him. So Pillay looks over the sketches, and he does some different kind of little mechanical drawings, and he winds up getting together with a nearby blacksmith and Obadiah Wheeler over in North Urbana. And he constructed this thing that was modular, that you could put it together and kind of take it apart as this rickshaw. So he put it together, he tested it out, it worked well, then he took the whole thing apart and shipped it over to Japan with instructions on how to put the thing together. And Jonathan Goebel does this for his wife and starts wheeling her around, and it became instantly popular. Everybody started copying that and building their own ones to transport people around. And one of the large reasons that this took off in popularity once it got seen and introduced was that there was a very high rate of unemployment at that time in the region that Goebel was in Japan. There were many, many people out of work. So it was very easy to form a little cottage industry by basically constructing one of these little carts and get yourself into the taxi business, right? Now you can be self-employed, get yourself as a taxi business and start moving around these wealthy people and start picking up fees and tips. So this rickshaw market exploded. Now, as they started building rickshaws, the other Japanese started adding improvements. They added springs to make the ride not so bumpy, and then a hooded top for the rickshaw to protect the passenger from the sun or the rain, wheel guards so the mud wouldn't splash on the passengers, and also they would put a cross piece across here. So in case something was very, very heavy, like several people in the rickshaw, you could have a couple of people pushing this rickshaw. Now, there is a lot of controversy over the origin of the rickshaw because there's actually 4 other inventors who have independently invented the rickshaw in various parts of the world. Over in Brazil and over in India and some other different sections, there are people who have constructed similar devices like that, but it appears that they did it independently. They all came up on the idea independently. But if you look at the documentation for Goebel's invention and the time frame, he can make a very strong claim for him being the original inventor of this rickshaw over in Japan. He's not given credit for it very much, though, because he probably would have if gotten credit as an inventor if he was just a nicer person. See, even though he became this missionary, Gold was quite unpopular despite his accomplishments because he never got rid of this hot temper that he had. And he could be quite abusive, quite rigid, quite intolerant, and prone to violence against the different people that were working for him, his servants, and even against his family. So he was known for abusing Japanese workers and his own family. And eventually he was ostracized by the Baptist hierarchy as a missionary because of his abusive behavior. And the Japanese like to credit the invention of the rickshaw to some other Japanese inventors and basically say Goebel was just this guy who took the idea of the rickshaw and used it to haul around all these heavy Bibles by his servants hauling the thing around. So it pays to be nice, because if you're not, sometimes you don't get credit where credit will be due to you. Our last person we could look at in our last story has to do with writing. Here are some very famous writers of the 1800s, the 19th century. And a little quiz question for you. Who was the most widely published American author in the 19th century? Of this cadre of different authors you see in front of you, Melville, Twain, Edgar Allan Poe, who sold the most books of all of those people? Look them over and make your guess. Well, if you guessed right, you would have guessed Harriet Beecher Stowe. Yeah, she not only wrote her famous Uncle Tom's Cabin, but also wrote a series of other novels that sold extremely well. But she had a close runner-up. It was her, and then another person, and everybody else was far, far behind in book sales. So who was the second person that was way up there in book sales? Well, actually, that was none other than an author who resided in Brockport, New York. A woman by the name of Mary James Holmes, who did all of her writing and lived most of her life in Brockport. She sold over 2 million books in her lifetime. And of course, those books were passed from person to person to person to person. So many, many, many people, more than 2 million, read her books. She published over 40 novels. She was originally born over in West Brookfield, Massachusetts in 1825, where she was the fifth of 9 children. And it was a family of very modest means. But from an early age, Mary was very interested in reading and learning, literature especially. And she was inspired by her uncle, Reverend Joel Hawes, and he was known for his published sermons as minister of the First Congregational Church of Hartford. He would give these sermons and then he would write them out and publish them, and she would read these and think it was fantastic. And she thought it was the greatest thing in the world to be able to write and have people read things that you wrote and what you wanted to say. Well, the father died when Mary Jane was 12 years old, but she was so well read to help support the family. She got a job teaching school when she was only 13 years old. That's how well read she was by that age. And actually, she published her first story at the age of 15. Now, she spent quite a while teaching school to support her younger brothers and sisters as they were growing up. So she didn't get married till she was a little bit older in those days, 24 years old. And she married Daniel Holmes in 1849. They lived in Kentucky for their first 3 years, but then they moved to Brockport, where they resided for the rest of their lives. And she began to write while her husband practiced law. In 1854, at the age of 29, she published her first novel, Tempest and Sunshine, which eventually sold 250,000 copies. Its central girl characters, Julie and Fanny, were modeled on a local family that Mary knew, and the portrayal of the girls with contrasting characters, they were like opposites, was resolved with a sense of moral justice as they both had their own personal journeys of growth. Even though they were so different, they both found their own individual paths to being accomplished people. So let's take a look at a sample of her writing so that you can kind of see what it was like. Here's the opening part of that novel I just mentioned. It was the afternoon of a bright October day. The old town clock had just tolled the hour of 4 when the Lexington and Frankfurt daily stage was heard rattling over the stony pavement in the small town of Vernon, Kentucky. In a few moments, the 4 panting steeds were reined up before the door of the Eagle, the principal hotel in the place. Mine host, a middle-aged, pleasant-looking man, came hustling out to inspect the newcomers and calculate how many would do justice to his beefsteaks, strong coffee, sweet potatoes, and corn cakes, which were being prepared in the kitchen by Aunt Esther. Here's another passage from another book, a little bit more of a moody type of a passage here. The night was dark, and the clouds black and heavy, which hung over Redstone Hall, whose massive walls loomed up through the darkness like some huge sentinel keeping guard over the spacious grounds by which it was surrounded. Within the house all was still, and without there was no sound to break the midnight silence, save the sighing of the autumnal wind through the cedar trees or the roar of the river, which when swollen by recent heavy rains, went rushing on to meet its twin sister at the point well known in Kentucky, where our story opens, as the forks of the Elkhorn. From one of the lower windows a single light was shining, and its dim rays fell upon the face of a white-haired man who moaned uneasily in his sleep, as if pursued by some tormenting fear. At last, as the old-fashioned clock struck in the hour of 12, he awoke, and glancing nervously towards the corner whence the sound proceeded, he whispered, "Have you come again, Ralph Lindley, to tell me of my sin?" "What is it, Mr. Rayborn? Did you call?" And a young girl glided to the bedside of the old man, who, taking her hand in his, the better to assure himself of her presence, said, "Marian, is there nothing in that corner yonder, nothing with silvery hair?" "Nothing," answered Marian, "nothing but the lamplight shining on the face of the old clock. Did you think there was someone here?" And that was very stylistic of the prose that was popular in the 1800s. Well, works by Mary Holmes were published by at least 50 book publishers, and many publishers pirated her works, or they took advantage of her popularity by attributing other authors' works to her. So they'd get a work by an author and put her name on it because they knew that would sell really well. Several of Holmes' novels were adapted to plays and movies, and she's reputed to be the best paid woman author of her time, next to Harriet Beecher Stowe. And many people insist actually Mary Jane Holmes made much more money in her lifetimes than Harriet Beecher Stowe made off of her writings. She was very widely read, even beyond her books, because a lot of her work was serialized in many of the most popular magazines and newspapers of the day. For example, how popular her stuff was when she serialized her novel Marian Gray in 1863 in the New York Weekly. It caused the paper's circulation to jump by 100,000 customers, additional customers that started buying that paper just to read her serialized novel. She was a national celebrity, and she was routinely interviewed by local newspapers whenever she traveled across the United States. Many tourists came to Brockport to see her home because she was so famous, and her home was known as the Brown Cottage. And they even had postcards in Brockport that you could buy. Here's a picture of her home to say you stopped and you saw the home of the famous author Mary Jane Holmes. She was actually not known as a famous author to the children on her street. She was known as the Cookie Lady, because next to her home was a large empty lot in her garden there, and she freely let all the children of the neighborhood play there. And she was known to the children as the Cookie Lady because she used to like to come out and give the children cookies and lemonade. She did not have any children of herself with her husband. She lived quite modestly and gave generously. She was quite active in the Episcopal Church there on Main Street of Rochester and many local charities. Matter of fact, that church still exists today. And not surprising, that church has Tiffany windows in it. And the church hall, when it existed back in the 1800s, was very elaborate. Had a bowling alley and dumbwaiters and all of these different meeting rooms. She gave generously to the church and the local charities. She traveled extensively to Europe and Asia and collected art from all over the world. And got very involved in special educational programs for young women. She organized a whole series of different educational classes and programs to teach young women about writing, literature, and of course, art. She knew from her art collections. Many people aren't aware of Mary James Holmes. If you took a course in literature, American literature, history of American literature, chances are she was excluded. She's long been excluded from literary histories of the 19th century, most of those written by literary critics who were men. But she's been reappraised by scholars in the late 20th and early 21st century who recognize her achievements and the value of her work. See, today when you look at, when literary scholars look at important authors, they not only look at literary merit, but they look at the impact on society. And she had a huge impact on society. At the start of the 1800s, if you look at the literacy rate of men and women, there was a huge gap. Only half of women knew how to read and write at the start of the 1800s, where 80% of men could. By the time the 1800s had closed, at the start of the 20th century, that literacy gap had been addressed and closed. And many people credit the enthusiastic response to Mary's novels for this huge increase in female literacy. All these women had friends that were reading her novels, telling her about these stories and how good they were, and it encouraged many, many, many young women, and older women as well, to learn how to read just so they could start reading her works. Also, if you look at her writings, she consistently portrayed the women in her novels as strong, independent characters who advanced in the world the same way as men did, which was not being done in other literature at that time. Thousands of women heard Susan B. Anthony speak through her lifetime when she made various whistle stops and she spoke in various halls. But millions and millions of women read and were inspired by Mary Holmes's novel and the role model that she established for women in society with strong women in her novels. Some historians have said that she did more than any other writer to prepare American women for the appeals of the early suffragette and women's rights movements in the late 1800s, in the late 1800s and early 20th century. You can see a plaque to Mary Jane Holmes at the site of her little brown cottage, after 40-plus novels sold. Unfortunately, her little brown cottage has gotten kind of gutted and turned into some kind of rundown student housing. And she would probably be sad to see that, but would be happy if she went over, and a poor house doesn't exist as it once did, but she would be happy to know that if she went over to the Brockport Library and clicked on the card catalog, she would still see a large series of her books still in print that young women could still read today, and her work lives on to inspire new generations of young women. So a very famous and influential author lived right here in the Rochester area, spent her whole life in Brockport, Mary Jane Holmes. Well, that concludes my talk about fun Western New York history. I have 2 other talks in this series. Maybe sometime in the future, I can come back and speak about some more fun Western New York history. And at this point, we'll turn it back to Grace, who's going to stop the recording and see if you have any questions.